Crime, megalomania, only desire to destroy. Everything in this world has two sides, and one as bright as the Pokémon world was inevitably going to cast dark shadows. But even there, we find differences, and some are more sinister than others. Today, we'll rank the antagonists of the main Pokémon line according to their malice, from the most compassionate to the most evil. However, we will only include the characters that can be considered the main antagonists of each game or generation, excluding characters such as Penny or Piers, because on paper, they are the bosses of more or less problematic gangs. Still, in the games, they have very different roles from the real antagonists and are far from representing danger. But the one who begins this ranking, despite being one of the characters with the least evil in his heart, was an enormous danger to the world. I'm talking, of course, about N. In the 5th generation, he's the antagonist, rival, co-protagonist, champion, secret boss. God, at some point you don't know if he's flirting or scolding you. Either way, N is the antagonistic force guiding the entire journey, while the player, having been through 4 other generations, represents the pillars on which the series had stood all that time. How through battles, Pokemon and trainers grow, evolve, and shine with their own light. This character and all the setting around him come to question that. From birth, he would be blessed with the unique gift of understanding the heart of Pokemon. So Getsis, recognizing in that abandoned child a 1 in a million talent, would begin to set in motion his plan. Getsis would give N a home, but isolating him from the outside world, he would manipulate his view of the bond between humans and Pokemon. He would spend his childhood among creatures that their trainers had mistreated. Seeing only the worst part of that bond, N would reach the crowning age with the view that it was natural and absolutely necessary for humans and Pokemon to live separately. Only then would there finally be justice and harmony in the world. Her adoptive sisters, the goddess of love and peace, would deliver one of the series' most powerful lines.
N's heart is pure and innocent.
But there is nothing more beautiful and terrifying than innocence.
His heart without darkness and his absolute faith in his convictions, even if they were built on a lie, made the Dragon of Truth choose him. But it was the innocence that caught the attention of the legendary that at the same time made him so easy to manipulate, nearly destroying all that's beautiful in the process. And the legendary, who had complete trust in the feelings of its chosen one, would not have questioned it. There is only one element that Getsis overlooked, ultimately ruining his perfect plan. You. The protagonist whose eyes reflects the power of ideals. When N meets you, someone who, despite representing the opposite of what he believes, has a bond with their Pokemon that defies everything, the seed of doubt is planted even with the ideas he was raised and indoctrinated with. And that doubt eventually germinates in the final battle, making him hesitate for an instant from his ideas in the face of a protagonist who, having built their beliefs based on experience and not on the words of others, didn't hesitate even for a moment. N is ultimately one of those strange souls without evil, and yet another piece in the message of these games. Nothing is just black or white. An overwhelming cry for light could have drowned the world in darkness. An angel and a demon can share the same fate, and even something as genuine as kindness and good intentions can be used to harm. But at the same time, that doubt that leads him to defeat is the beginning of something much more beautiful, as someone who wakes up and begins to seek his own truth, one built by his own actions, and that this time, he indeed can do his bit for a better world. Moving on with the ranking, our next members can't be said to harbor any evil in their hearts. Although benevolence is certainly not something that defines them either. The artificial intelligence of the professor in the 9th generation was surprising to say the least. Now, I'll be talking in particular about Sada because I played Scarlet, and the contrast of the prehistoric creatures with the super tech setup of the ending resonates more with me, but obviously this applies to both characters. To try to judge the actions of this entity, one would have to understand the actions of the matrix on which it was created, which of course is not an easy task. The professor was an ambiguous character. The game doesn't make entirely clear what underlies her goals and traumas, but you can read between the lines that she was disappointed with the world, obsessed with the romantic idea of times gone by, and determined to recreate that fantastic world in which she could live happily with her family. Without going to the extremes names of other characters on the ranking, we can agree that she seems far from being a good person. Her obsession paradoxically made her neglect her son, for whom she had precisely started all that in the first place. She also worked ignoring the possible side effects of her actions, such as the havoc on the region's ecosystems that would be caused by the inevitable breakout of species from other eras. She's another of the characters from this generation that somehow echoes with a certain part of fandom, obsessed with romanticizing the past and losing track of what is important. Someone whose heart, seen in a certain way, harbors quite a bit of evil. But let's remember that the antagonist of the game is not the professor, who is no longer with us, but her artificial intelligence, a copy of her thoughts, experiences, traumas, insecurities, and dreams, implanted in a robotic body thanks to the dream technology that crystals allow, created to help her in the project to see her absurd fantasies completed and replace her in case something happened to the original, with the ability to be overwritten in case the project was in danger by the darkest and ruthless Paradise Protection Protocol. But all that in the end materializes in a new consciousness with a totally unexpected vision. AI Sada seems to be aware of the problems that the professor, perhaps blinded by her emotions, was stubbornly ignoring. It asks for our help to stop the nonsense for which it has been programmed, even if that means destroying it. It goes so far as to confess that the probability of us winning is 0, but it seems to see something special in the player that defies mathematics. And in the very end, it even goes out of its way to minimize the damage to Arven's heart, as his real mother was not able to do. As an entity whose actions are very limited to what it was conceived for, its morality can hardly be measured by the same criteria as the rest. But if we look at its actions, we see how during the game the AI tries to look for the slightest loophole to achieve its own defeat, seeking a common good that is opposite to the objective with which it was programmed. And that for me is one of the greatest acts of heroism seen in the series. Because Pokémon is full of heroes and heroines, chosen ones, destined to save the world, a world that puts all the tools at their disposal to achieve it. But to save the region by going against your own nature and the single and inescapable purpose of your existence is certainly something superior. I really appreciate how that ending at Area Zero doesn't try to close from one day to the next such deep wounds. Death, not being able to say goodbye, and pain are there, more present than ever. But at the end of the day, we have 4 children looking ahead to fight for a better future, learning from the mistakes of the previous generation. But this is as far as this small part of the ranking dedicated to heroes would go. From now on, growing darkness will gradually invade the souls of the characters, as in the tragic story of Lusamine, a great woman who, together with her family, created the Ether Foundation, an organization that looked after the well-being of the Pokémon and ecosystems of Alola. In the region where regional forms were introduced for the first time, telling us a story of invasive and displaced species, and also serious environmental problems, her struggle speaks volumes about how committed she was to protecting and caring for Pokémon and nature, standing out for her great problem-spotting ability, intelligence, and decisive personality. But at an undetermined point in time, Lusamine and her husband became interested in ultra-space and ultra-wormholes based on the myths of the region, perhaps seeing in them potential for their cause, studying other dimensions to improve the living conditions in Alola. So they decided to invest a good part of their resources in the investigation of those myths mentioned in the popular legends of the region, until everything was unfairly broken, and an ultra-wormhole absorbed Mon, taking away Lusamine's beloved forever. It was there that the organization would take a dark 180-degree turn to reach Ultra Space at all costs and rescue him. Lusamine was so obsessed that she would begin to dress her close people in the image and likeness of these beasts, even authorizing terrible experiments to achieve her goal, which is why her children would definitely rebel against her. The point of ultimate threat would come with the release of the Ultra Beast throughout the world, something that could have ended it, as the games show in parallel universes in which this happened. Worlds that have lost their light. An enormous and unforgivable evil, if it weren't for the fact that at no time was herself. Yeah, the tragic incident made Lusamine a gloomy and desperate woman, but the trigger for her terrible actions wasn't that, but Nihiligo, an ultra beast she was able to make contact with during the investigations to rescue Mon. It was the toxins of this Pokemon that caused her madness, eliminated all her morals, and made her become the delusional villain we know in the games. Lusamine is a good person in her own right, and if she was charmed by darkness, it was to protect and get back her family, until this intrusive element entered the equation and plunged her into a total evil, where her actions were definitely corrupted. For whenever we have seen glimpses of her without external interference, we have seen someone affable, committed to the common good, and who knows how to see the value in others. Like the next on the ranking, Guzma. In his words, she was the only adult who reached out to him and at the time knew how to appreciate him. It was a rather maternal relationship, but with Lusamine's descent into madness, it would turn into subordination, manipulation, and dependence. However, at some point it was genuine, which is why the boss of Team Skull is so loyal to her, even in her unhinged version of the games. Now focusing on Guzma, I wasn't sure if I should include him in the video, since his role in the games is quite ambiguous, but he's one of my favorite characters of the whole series, so here we are. From here on, however, we continue with characters in a rather evident moral gray area. As a criminal gang, Team Skull was undoubtedly the most harmless of the series, very rarely causing any major problems in the region beyond pranks, and above all intimidating and annoying the rookie trainers who had just embarked on the challenge in which they had failed. It's because of the influence of Lusamine that during the events of the game, they start stealing Pokemon and some more serious actions. Guzma is a cocky and violent guy, but it's obvious how all of that is a shell he forged as one of the characters with the most tragic past in the series, one who has known nothing but disdain and abuse from everyone around him since he was very young. In Team Skull, he found his true family, a group that brings together people who, like him, are not the strongest or most talented, but support each other and survive in their own way. Like his team, he has some crimes behind his back, but they have codes and values when dealing with their own. Guzma is a guy with a lot of resentment inside and some questionable actions on his record, but he would never betray his people, and when he considers that something needs to be fought for, he shows great bravery. Especially compared to other villains, in no way do I see him putting the region or the world in danger if he had the chance. In any case, he would most likely have fought against that danger if only to defend his own. As for the topic we are analyzing, I would place him last, in a neutral ground with some tendency to good, but the true neutral on the list could only be one: Colress. As you all know, this is a character that comes to break with the entire narrative of his generation. Although Ghetsis is the one who appears next to Kyurem, it's this character, the colorless one, who represents its true essence. Just as the monster of Unova was left empty after it's being split apart, and searches incessantly for a hero to fill its heart with truth and ideals, Colress's actions are completely devoid of anything we can understand as morality. He pursues knowledge for the sake of it, as the only ideal he contemplates in his life, without any hidden ambition or double reading. It could even be said that his purpose is the purest and most genuine seen in an antagonist, a purity that in a way makes him fearsome. Science, like everything else, has a duality, and we soon see this character both experimenting on others without any scruples and carrying out heroic actions. In a world like the one presented by the 5th generation, immersed in the moral dispute of good, evil, and what it means or doesn't mean to train Pokemon, seeing someone with such a different view break down that discourse is refreshing. Although I had already spoiled that in a ranking of villains he would be the true neutral, it's hard to say that someone so cynical, the most Machiavellian guy in the series, willing to do anything to progress with his research, is a good person. This gap between what is fair and what is evil, and his apparent slight psychopathy when it comes to treating others as test subjects, places him in this middle ground, even in a ranking full of such detestable beings. We are getting dangerously close to the true malice, but before we dive into the truly scary part of the ranking, we have the last characters that, with rather more dark implications than those seen so far, still have some redeeming qualities. Starting with Chairman Rose. Another guy with strong convictions and a great ability to detect problems that apparently at some point lost track of reality and control over his actions. But unlike Lusamine, not by an external agent that manipulated him, but by a narcissism that has nothing to envy to the most horrifying beings of the series. In the 8th generation, we learn how the Galar region and the Pokemon world in general, with its frenetic style of living, is inescapably heading towards an energy crisis that will end everything. Rose, who comes from a very poor core family suffered from his childhood the first blows of that crisis, which would lead him and his brother to promise that someday they would solve it and save Galar. With that goal in mind, to accumulate power to take action and change things, Rose would rise socially at breakneck speed, acquiring ever greater relevance, crowned in being invested as chairman of the Pokémon League, which in the region where the sport of battling has the greatest influence meant having Galar in his hands. It was probably this dramatic and unstoppable career rise that made him develop this egocentricity, one big enough to make him believe that he would be able to control a planetary menace like Eternatus and turn it into his personal battery, to supply the world with energy, probably forcing him to steal it from other planets. Could it be that even his specialization in Steel-type Pokémon comes from the fact that, since he was a child, he studied the Darkest Day and searched for the most effective type to face it? He overestimated his capabilities so much that even when estimates said the world's energy would be exhausted in 1,000 years, he executed his plan without waiting a single day. The community made a lot of memes with this, but analyzing it from his psychology, it makes perfect sense. If he was the chosen one of the legends and his victory was guaranteed, why wait any longer? Even more so when the energy problem was already causing many people to suffer. His theme, with a divine vibe, with a choir singing Rosa Salva Credo, I believe in the rose in Latin, is a good symbol of how this character perceived himself. Obviously, at no time was he aware of the magnitude of what he had in his hands. Eternatus, which was much more powerful than his calculations, having been sealed all that time accumulating energy, went out of his control, crushed the strongest trainer in the world in its restricted form, and in its final form would have devastated the region, and who knows if the Pokémon world had it not been for the union of the legendary heroes in their best version. I could spend hours talking about this, but going to the heart of the matter, he's a character with noble intentions and strong convictions, friendly and considerate with the rest, but that kind face hid in his inner self, a sinister egomania. Just counting this would make him a fairly neutral character, but his unconsciousness and the catastrophic implications his actions could have brought, for me, make him take a firm step to the side of evil. Archie and Maxie are practically identical, but to talk about these characters, we should first define which version of them we are referring to. Ruby Sapphire and their remakes or Emerald, since there are very noticeable differences in their actions and roles. Today I'm going to stay with Ruby and Sapphire, my favorite dynamic for these characters, because in Emerald we see an open war between both sides, maniacs and crazy alike, with an equal distribution of their misdeeds and acts of vandalism. Personally, I found more interesting their dynamic in the original versions, where one of the two teams was the one that took things to the extreme, threatening the balance and carrying out the eco-terrorism attacks we all know, while the opposing team was born as a response to it, trying to stop them and protect the Pokemon, aquatic or terrestrial, mostly harmed by their misdeeds. The characters of the villainous team, Archie and Sapphire, and Maxie and Ruby, would stay at this point. Despite having zero restraints when it comes to stealing, intimidating, or kidnapping, their teams are inspired by the rise of eco-activism that Japan experienced in the early 2000s, propelled by major climatic events, so we can say that they tried to respond to real problems, such as the shortage of water and farmland with the growing overpopulation of the Pokemon world. Their mistake, however, was practically identical to Rose's, believing that simple humans using superstitions and esoteric ideas could control such colossal forces as the creation legendaries. Their evil is born of that unconsciousness. Despite this, we still find a lot of redemption in them. Both impose on their teams a very strict code of handling Pokemon, and their motto is to take care of both their own and wild Pokemon in the best way possible. Far from what we had seen up to that moment with criminal gangs that mistreated them and used them as tools. There's also in both teams a strong sense of fellowship from the lowest recruit to the first in command. Similar to Team Skull, they treat each other like a big family, and even the grunts themselves tell you how it's Archie's big heart and his enormous capacity for sacrifice and protective character with the rest that made them interested in the team. Also, unlike others, once they realized their mistake, they immediately stepped back and tried to fix all the problems they had caused. By the standard of the series' villains, still with one foot on the dark side, mainly because of the consequences of what they wanted to accomplish, they are the last ones I would place in redeemable territory. So if you are ready, let's resume the worst part of the infernal judgment: with Giovanni as the villain par excellence, and the first great twist in the series with his presentation as the last gym leader, surrounded by the irresistible mystery of the first generation. He's a good way to open this darker part of the list, being still a relatively gray character, even quite enigmatic as to the origins of Team Rocket and the true motivation of his deeds, because his evil was always questioned, fitting several of his actions with theories and rumors of a supposedly misunderstood hero in the shadow. But there is something undeniable. When the protagonist defeats him, we can see how he somehow still loves Pokémon, deciding to resume his research, his original passion for them, with some light in the depths of his heart. But everything would change with the Rainbow Rocket episode in the 7th generation, denying all these hopes to a great extent, and proving that not only is he not a hero, but that he's an even more sinister character than he appeared to be. This epilogue makes it clear how all his actions were aimed at an unstoppable ambition of unlimited power, and in the universe in which the player for unknown reasons fails to stop him, these would bear fruit, regaining control over Mewtwo to take his power even further with the power of Mega Evolution, which would make him unstoppable, falling all regions of the world under his cruel dominion. But even that would be too small for him, having in mind a plan to gain control over all the universes, resulting in the events that take place in this post-game. The noble intentions turn into a mere thirst for power, seeing others as tools and authorizing and executing terrible acts to achieve it. Even though, in theory, he still had that love for Pokémon in some part of his soul, that little sparkle in his heart would be so hidden that only a miracle would bring it to light. But returning to the natural order of the ranking, it's finally time to descend to the basement of horrors where the monster welcomes us. Ghetsis. To begin with, if there is something terrifying about this character, it's that his actions are not born as usual in the series from a distorted vision of the world and the way to deal with its conflicts, but from aberrant ideas about himself. We know nothing of his childhood, nor the reason for this self-perception. He doesn't even seem to have any interest in the future of things and the problems of the world, as did the previous and some of the following villains. His desire for power and control is born from a blind conviction that this is what he's entitled to by divine will. The most evil and extreme embodiment of an absolute king, with a team that are basically servants of even quite medieval aesthetics. And to be honest, he doesn't seem to come from a royal family, because he possesses an intelligence far superior to what we are used to seeing in these characters, manifested above all in an unparalleled planning skill, which brought him close to glory. Because there are higher forces at work in the Pokémon world that, realistically, would have intervened had most of these characters approached their rushed and grandiloquent desires for destruction. But Ghetsis went even further. His plan was so meticulously formulated that it could be said that he was the first to succeed in manipulating the legendaries. Studying the legends of the region, he discovered the power of the two dragons, but quickly understood that his heart was far from the purity that would attract its attention and allow him to use them. That's why he would start adopting several prospects until he found the best of them all, a child whose innocence and love were found once every 100 years. Someone like that would not only convince the dragon's heart, but would also be easily manipulated to turn him into the enforcer of his plan, planting doubt in people's minds so that they began to see of their own free will training Pokémon as unacceptable, while he and his organization amassed more and more power. At the same time, N was traveling around the region, beating them all at their own game, and gaining a popularity that gave even more credibility to his propaganda. With the legendary under his strings, even several aces up his sleeve, such as an invincible army of mechanical clones of a powerful prehistoric Pokémon that would crush even the legendary if something went wrong and it was necessary. It's horrifying to see how he had everything so measured that in any universe in which an exceptional and external element such as the player didn't exist, he would have gotten away with it. Going back to the theme of the video, evil, I think it goes without saying why we are on a completely different level to any of the characters we have seen so far. Not only is his egomania unparalleled, but his goal is the most disastrous so far. He is one of the few on the ranking who seems to take joy in pain and suffering. Even in the case of the player, he shows to have something personal against him, being the only element that he didn't expect and that would make his plan fail. Surely many of you would even expect to see him as number one in terms of cruelty, but you have to admit that at least there are no known fatalities on his back, so he seems to maintain a minimum consideration for life that for me distances him quite a bit from what is to come. Yeah. With Kyurem's power, they froze an entire city in black and white too, and plan to do it with all of Unova. But seeing how after the incident everything is back to normal and the NPCs themselves are unscathed, does it seem like it was something reversible? Anyway, the Team Plasma in these games acts very desperate, and Ghetsis himself seems to have gone completely crazy after the humiliation of those years, so you can't get much out of his actions there either. He still ends up outside the podium of the, for me, indisputably 3 worst calamities the series has seen, the most opposite extreme imaginable to everything Pokémon stands for. Third place in this Hall of Infamy goes to Lysander. There is not a lot redeemable in him in terms of humanity. At some point, he seems to have identified legitimate problems in the Pokemon world, such as the increasing shortage of resources, and how, no matter how many generations passed, identical conflicts kept repeating over and over again. A degeneration of the values he refers to as beauty. But apparently, his unstoppable popularity would overdevelop his narcissism and megalomania, giving him, in his own eyes, the moral authority to execute his morbid vision at any cost. And what solution did he find to protect that beauty, killing anyone who doesn't share and actively supports that vision? It's perhaps the greatest example of hypocrisy and cynicism seen in a villain, because if only he recruited people with special awareness and intelligence to Team Flare to keep alive. But instead of that, he started recruiting rich people. And when interacting with the recruits, you see how they are even more stupid than the average villainous team of the series, which is saying something, and they are far from being good people. In any case, they represent all the defects of the society that he criticized, and with those roots he wanted to build I don't know what new world of beauty. Even Lysander himself is a descendant of the nobility of the region, which in his head gives him the authority to assemble all this, but in reality this aristocracy was responsible for great wars, atrocities, and many of the problems that society drags today. Probably based on real-world problems, if he had prospered, he would have created a much sicker and more decadent world. The 6th generation talks us about the magic of encounters, the miracle of being alive, and this psychopath and his total disregard for life is hardly beatable in terms of evil, but there is one character who, with a similar motivation, intended to take things even further. Volo. From the very first minutes of the game, his name gives us the clue that his warm and affable attitude hides something, an unbreakable will aimed at something that for the moment only he knows. Viewing himself as the rightful heir to a lineage of those chosen by the true Pokemon God, he dedicated his entire life to a deep and exhaustive research of the myths of the world, dreaming of a final encounter with Arceus that would allow him to fulfill his destiny, to reset this corrupted world. In other words, a religious extremist who seeks to destroy not the world like Lysander, but the universe, to recreate it according to his fanatical and selfish vision. Just like that, we have jumped from a planetary genocide to a universal one, and only Arceus knows the pathological vision he had in his head for that ideal universe, or the requirements to be one of the chosen survivors. Probably having blood from those ancient Sinnoh people alluded to in the game, ideas far more perverse and heinous even than Team Flare's pay to win. His only tiny point of redemption is how after defeating him, he seems to rethink things, perhaps forced by the implicit rejection shown to him by the god to whom he has dedicated his life to. He wonders if the world is beautiful as it is and doesn't need to be remade. Perhaps the doubt already existed within him and the defeat only made it grow. So maybe if he had been victorious and had been in a real position to do so, his confidence would have been weakened, a faint glimmer of light. But in this last character, it's completely impossible to find a single sparkle. Someone who, paradoxically, would incarnate the sun god, Cyrus. As you have seen, the series is full of twisted beings whose actions bring along catastrophe, either out of ignorance of the extent of the issues at hand, or because they directly consider the blood, pain, and life of others an acceptable price to pay to see their reality manifested. But there's a difference between that and having total annihilation as your goal and ideal to achieve. Cyrus simply rejects life, which he refers to in his speech as spirit. Raised in isolation from others and unable to establish emotional bonds with other people, he grew up surrounded by machines. In its mechanisms and functioning, he would find a shelter of peace and perfection, a lack of unpredictable and disruptive elements, which made everything work as expected. That made everything as it was meant to be. By the way, maybe playing his own remakes as a kid would have changed his mind. Seeing people and Pokémon from a distance, so conflictive and unpredictable, Cyrus would conclude that the origin of all conflict and problems in the world was the spirit, present in living beings, causing this perfect universe to begin to distort and alter. The only way to create a beautiful and perfect world was to eliminate the virus of life. Cyrus is an individual with a completely distorted and sick idea of reality, but above all, as we have been pointing out, with an unbreakable willpower to carry it out. Both characters, Cyrus and Volo, find the origin of their goals in a pathological perception of reality and the will to carry it out at any cost, as if the evil of that descendant of the Celestica people had been reincarnated generations later. But if you examine it closely, they are also opposites. On the one hand, we have the hyper-pragmatic and mathematical reality that Cyrus seeks where the spirit is the problem, and with Volo on the other, an ultra-religious and fundamentalist vision, where precisely the lack of that spirit is what has been degrading and deteriorating the world to an irreversible point. That's why the latter, in his outrageous ideas, had at least one small concern for future generations. The boss of Team Galactic, however, wants to wipe out everything and everyone and create a new world in which he will be the only life form, the only worthy spectator of a world that works as it should, like the hands of an eternal clock, never to be altered by anything. The fact that he called his organization like the old Galaxy team, which had nothing to do with his goal, symbolizes his vision of the universe as a whole working in unison, with all matter in order and each element in its place, except for that spirit that, arising spontaneously, would become a germ that would devour everything, tarnishing that perfection and making it all unpredictable, low and unworthy, considering himself the only one worthy of inhabiting that ideal world. And once it was built, he planned to eliminate even the legendaries that would allow him to create it, whom he considered nothing more than tools, somewhat more sophisticated than the rest, but tools after all. Even so, deep down he's aware that he is nothing more than another human being, a manifestation of that spirit that even in the heat of battle is carried away by his emotions. His tales about regarding himself as worthy of being the sole survivor and guide of that new world are nothing but pure instinct of disguised self-preservation, which of course, in the worst imaginable way, is limited to himself. He didn't intend to show even the slightest mercy to his closest Pokémon or comrades at the time of the spirit's total eradication. He may not openly enjoy the pain and suffering of others, but his total disregard for life and everything the Pokémon world stands for makes him the ultimate antagonist to the ideals of the series, and the purest idea of evil we've ever seen.